This is Ethics, Lecture 5 on Kant. One of the most important points that Immanuel Kant argues is the emphasis that he places on duty. And so I'll begin with this very straightforward and simple quote from the reading. In the case of what is to be morally good, it is not enough that it conform with the moral law, but it must also be done for the sake of the moral law. The idea here is fairly straightforward. If you do something out of duty, you do it not because you want to do it. You don't do it by accident. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it for the sake of the law. So, for example, if you go to a relative's house over the holidays and you do it out of duty, you may in fact have no desire whatsoever to do it. And for Kant, not having desire to do it gives you more moral worth. This is the idea that Kant really wants to stress here, that what makes us moral in the end, it's not our animal nature, it's not our instinct, it's not our passions, it's not our pleasures or desires, it's our capacity to act for the sake of the moral law, basically to act out of reason. So in this sense, Kant is very much in line with what we've talked about with Plato, and to a lesser degree with Aristotle as well, with this emphasis being placed on reason. Now, so again, to act in conformity with the moral law means that you do something and it's right. So here's an example that I use that's, I think, very helpful getting at what Kant's about. Let's take a case where there's and this actually happened about 15, 20 years ago. There was a plane crash in D.C., and what happened was the plane's wings had iced, and the plane crashed into the Potomac River. And a number of people survived, and they were kind of in the broken fuselage that was floating in the middle of the river. And there was one person who was on his way to a job interview, and he kind of stopped to kind of see what was going on. And the whole time there was a helicopter that had a rope down, and people were holding onto the rope and being dragged to the shore. And one woman was holding onto the rope, but she was blinded temporarily by the jet fuel, and the rope kept letting go of the rope. And this guy dived into the water, swam out, held onto the woman, held onto the rope, and brought her to safety. And in fact, one person that was left on the fuselage after this woman was rescued ended up drowning. So, I mean, he basically saved this woman's life. Well, he became a local hero, and he was on like the morning talk shows, and because he was unemployed and on his way to a job interview, he ended up getting all kinds of job offers. So let's assume that there's this person. He saw this woman. She needed to be helped, and he did what needed to be done, what was the right thing to do. So you could say that he did it for the sake of the law. In other words, he did it because it was his duty. He saw it as his duty to do that. It's the right thing to do. It wasn't because he wanted to do it. It wasn't because it was getting him anything, and so on and so forth. Turns out he did get the job, and good things came his way as a result, but that wasn't why he did it. So that's what's meant by doing it for the sake of the law. Now let's imagine someone else. They're in the same situation, but they think to themselves, if I rescue this woman, I may actually get a good job offer and some good things might come my way. So he swims out, rescues the woman, and so on. So from the appearance, the actions are exactly the same. But there's a moral difference. One is done out of duty, one's done for the sake of the law, and one is simply conforming with the moral law. In other words, he did what conforms with the moral law, but he didn't do it because it was the right thing to do. In fact, he did it because he was hoping to get a good job as a result. So that's the basic distinction that Kant's got underlying his moral theory. And the big emphasis here is upon duty. And again, duty is something that one does not because it brings one pleasure, but more importantly, it's something one does because it's the right thing to do. This leads then to another important distinction for Kant, and that's the distinction that Kant makes between goodwill and basically everything else. So I want to read a passage from page 273 in your book. So if this is a different edition, it's going to be the first paragraph of section 1, the transition from common rational to philosophic moral cognition. So I'll read this passage.
Kant argues it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will. Okay, actually, I'm just going to read that first sentence. The distinction here is we've got that which is good without qualification and that which is good with qualification. And to look at that sentence again, he says it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation or qualifications, except a good will. So there's a lot of things that are good in the world, but there's only one thing that is good without qualification, and that is the good will. So what does that mean then? That means that everything else is good with qualifications. So what is this saying? Basically, the idea is that anything that is good with qualifications has certain conditions that need to be met in order for it to be good. Ice cream is good, but if it's not the right flavor, or if it's melted, or various other conditions aren't met, it's not good. A college degree is good, but it's good in large part because of certain conditions that it meets. It gives you a good chance for a job. It gives you some knowledge or learning. There's a number of conditions that it meets that makes it good. As Kant goes on to argue in the rest of that paragraph, he says, understanding, wit, judgment, and the like, whatever such talents of mind may be called, or courage, resolution, and perseverance in one's plans, as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable for many purposes, but they can also be extremely evil and harmful if the will which is to make use of these gifts of nature, and whose distinctive constitution is therefore called character, is not good. So, understanding, wit, judgment, courage, even happiness, as he goes on to say, all those things might seem to be good, but as he argues, if the will that makes use of them is bad, then they are not good. So, intelligence. If someone is extremely intelligent and smart, you wouldn't want them to put that intelligence to bad use. They could be like Thrasymachus's person that we spoke about a few lectures ago, where they commit perfect injustice because of their intelligence and cunning. So intelligence is not good without qualification. It has to be qualified by the will that makes use of it. So the will, however, knows if the will is good, then nothing can take that away. So he goes on in the next page to say, and I won't read, you can read it for yourselves, and you'll see what he argues is that if your will is good, nothing can take that away. Even if you fail, the will is still good. He does add in a parenthetical comment, however, that it's not a mere wish. In other words, one can't simply say, well, I was going to pick you up from the airport, but I was just too tired. I wanted to sleep, and so I really couldn't do it. No, Kant is arguing that if one's will is really good, then one does everything in one's power to fulfill that will. And it's not a mere wish. So what we end up with then, according to Kant, is we have a distinction between what one's intentions are versus the consequences of one's actions. Now, granted, if one has a good will, then one is no doubt has a will to do something that will bring about good consequences. The person who dived into the river to save that woman, his intentions or his will was to rescue that woman. It was his duty to save this woman's life as he saw it. But even if he had failed, even if he hadn't gotten there in time and was unsuccessful, his will still would have been good. And even if the other guy who had the selfish motive had succeeded in rescuing the woman, even though on the surface, by appearance, the one guy did something better, he rescued the woman, the other guy didn't, morally, the person who was unsuccessful is more moral than the other one because he was acting out of duty, whereas the other one was not. So part of the issue here for Kant then is with our goodwill is that our will needs to be something that we have over our control. In other words, a key issue for Kant is this notion of free will. If our will is going to be good, then we must have some choice over whether we act according to duty or not. this is one of the reasons why if one does something because it brings one pleasure, then it lacks in moral worth. It's not immoral, it's just amoral. For example, if one likes to work in the soup kitchen for the poor, or one likes to work in Habitat for Humanity, or any of a number of charitable things because it brings one pleasure, and one does it in order to get that pleasure and that satisfaction, well, that is an amoral action because doing things for the sake of pleasure is neither moral or immoral, just acting out of one's natural instincts or inclinations. Acting out of duty means to act out of a choice, out of free will. And that's why for Kant it's extremely important to prove that we have free will, because there were people in Kant's era who argued that we are fully determined in everything that we do, that there is no free will, that our actions are caused and predetermined by everything that went before it. There's a famous French philosopher named Jacques-Offray de la Mettrie who wrote a book called Man a Machine and Man a Plant, a couple books he wrote. And in both he argues basically that we are a sophisticated machine. And so just as you wouldn't think that your car, if it's not starting one morning, isn't failing to start out of some free will, it's not choosing not to start, it's something's broken, it's a mechanism, it's a machine, and something is not working right, and that's why it's not starting. The same is true for human beings, as people like Lemaitre argue, that we are completely determined in all that we do. Everything happens according to natural laws. So in order to make the case that we have free will and therefore the capacity to have a good will, Kant has to put forth an argument for free will. And the argument for free will, put simply, is basically the notion that we are able to grasp universal laws of nature. Now, a universal law of nature is something like the law of gravity. It's something that applies to the entire universe without exception. That's the other thing that makes it universal. And the thing that interests Kant is, what is it about human beings? What faculty do they have that enables them to grasp such a universal law? I mean, here we are just a finite, not even the strongest animal on the planet, and yet we're able to grasp something that applies not only to the planet, but to all the things in the universe. I mean, more recently, if you've been following headlines, the discovery of the God particle and the theories that go around that. I mean, we've been able to figure out why everything in the universe has mass. And so, what enables us to do that? How can we understand something that applies to the whole universe? Well, part of it is because we possess reason. Well, what is it about reason that enables us to grasp something that applies to the whole universe? The short answer is the reason is free. In other words, our reason is itself not determined by natural law. In other words, it's free of the determinism of nature. And it's only because it's free from the determinism of nature that it can step outside nature to grasp the universal laws of nature itself. And so this is Kant's argument for free will. And this is why you'll find in the readings that we have this constant reference to universal law of nature, like the law of gravity, and universal moral laws. The difference, of course, is that a universal law of nature, we have no choice but to follow it. In other words, I can't decide if I'm falling off a building that now's a good time not to follow the law of gravity. I'm going to fall regardless. Nothing I can do to violate the laws of nature. This is precisely what those who believe in determinism are arguing, that everything is determined by natural law, and therefore nothing happens freely or by choice. We just simply aren't aware of all the factors that are causing our choices. That's at least what the determinists are arguing. But for Kant, to the extent that our will is determined by knowledge of a universal law that we can choose to follow, this is what he means by a universal moral law, that's the extent to which our actions are moral. This leads then to probably the most famous principle of Kant's moral philosophy, what's called the categorical imperative. Now, the categorical imperative is contrasted with the hypothetical imperative. And the hypothetical imperative basically is if you want to do something, then it's imperative or you have to do something else. So if you want to pass Philosophy 313, then it's imperative to take a midterm, a final, and all the various other things. Although in the online class, there's different imperatives that apply to you to pass this particular class. But as you know, any class that you would take, there are certain things you have to do if you want to pass the class. It's the if that makes it hypothetical, right? That means there's going to be an exception. Some people decide they don't really care whether they pass the class or not. They stop doing what they have to do to pass the class, and then they end up failing the class, which is sort of perfectly fine because the the imperative was hypothetical. It only was something that was what needed to be done only if they wanted to attain a certain end. Categorical imperatives, however, are different. And as Kant defines a categorical imperative, he says, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So, in other words, this is something that one is supposed to do, that one could will that everyone else, without exception, can become, that everyone else, without exception, can do it as well. This leads to what I call the universality test. In other words, if one is about to do something, then one takes what they're about to do, turns it into a universal law that they can at the same time will that everyone else can do the same thing without exception. So let's take the example of cutting in line. If cutting in line is the only way that you can get tickets for a show that you want to see, then should you cut in line? Well, on the one hand, you could say, well, yes, it's the only way you can get tickets. But then the question then for Kant is it moral? Is it in accordance with duty to cut in line? And that's when you do the universality test. And you ask yourself, what would happen if I turned what I'm about to do into a universal law that applied without exception to everyone else? What this would mean then would be that everyone else, if the only way they could get tickets would be to cut in line, they could cut in line. Well, as you realize, what would happen then if one did that is that there would be no line left, and suddenly you wouldn't be able to get the tickets you wanted. So you can't will that it become a universal law. It reaches a contradiction because if you make it a universal law, suddenly there's no line and you can't get the tickets. And that's the idea here. According to Kant, when we are generally unjust or immoral, what we are doing is we are treating ourselves as an exception to a rule that we want everyone else to follow. And so the idea then is that if we are going to be moral, we are going to follow rules that we could allow and will everyone else to follow as well. So in a really important sense, Kant's categorical imperative is a sort of sophisticated version of the golden rule. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. Now, with this universality test in hand, in the reading, Kant discusses 4 examples. We'll look at 2 of these examples. The first example he talks about is suicide. As he goes on to say, suicide, you can imagine a person who, due to suffering or any of a number of problems, decides that the best way to end this suffering, both for themselves and others perhaps, is to end their lives. And so it's kind of out of a principle of self-love, as Kant argues, there was a desire to end their own suffering, that they choose to end their own life. So maybe someone in the late stages of a very, very horrific disease, and you can see the side where Dr. Kevorkian would often assist people in taking their own life. It was doctor-assisted suicide. And they would often record videos beforehand to say, yes, I'm here of my own will. I'm suffering from Lou Gehrig's or some other condition, and I don't want to go on in a debilitated state. So I want to end the suffering for myself early and the suffering for those around me. And so they would then go on and commit suicide with the assistance of Dr. Kevorkian. Well, the question then that Kant would have you ask is basically plug in that universality test. What would happen if you made it a universal law that everyone, following this principle of self-love, committed suicide? Well, there's a couple things that would go wrong. One, if everyone did it, there'd be no one left, right? Everyone would have committed suicide. And it doesn't have to be the case that everyone actually does it, right? Not everyone's going to actually cut in line, but you still can't will that everyone do it, because then there would be a contradiction. Similarly, you can't will that everyone commit suicide, because then there would be no one left to kill, because there would be no persons left. And the other way in which it reaches a contradiction is that the basic notion of self-love by nature is there for the preservation of our lives, not the destruction of our lives. So to have nature built on a principle of self-love that leads to the destruction of life contradicts the very notion of what this self-love principle is there for in the first place. So suicide is something that fails the universality test, and so therefore, if we are going to be moral and act on our duty, regardless of what the consequences are, we would not commit suicide. The second example he gives is an example of a false promise. Someone who needs to be lent money promises that they'll repay the money, but knows they won't repay the money. It's fairly straightforward to recognize that this is wrong, and we knew it was wrong even before taking this class. But now we can see how Kant would analyze it. You take what you're about to do, that you promise to repay money, knowing you won't repay it, and you turn that into a universal law that everyone promises something but never fulfills the promise. In other words, every promise made is a false promise. Well, if every promise made is a false promise, no one would ever believe a promise. And so therefore, no one would lend you the money because they would just laugh at your promise. And so this is where we have the obvious contradiction here, that one wouldn't have been lent the money if they had made a false promise, if they had made a universal law that everyone else could do the same thing. And this is the point I remember my mother would have told me when I was young. What would happen if everyone else did the same thing? And this sort of question, what would happen if everyone else did the same thing, is really Kant's universality test, sort of told in kind of everyday speech, just sort of how one's mother might tell their young child. But the basic idea for Kant is that as we grow and develop, in the same sort of way that Aristotle was talking about this, our capacity to use reason also kicks in our capacity to recognize duty, because duty and moral law and reason all kind of merge and grow up together. And this leads to a very important notion for Kant, that part of being human is the capacity to use reason to recognize and act out of duty. And this leads to a distinction that Kant makes between persons versus things. And I'll read a passage from the text. This is about halfway through the reading in the third edition of the Ethics. It's on page 289, but I'll read. It says, "Now I say that the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. Instead, he must in all his actions, whether directed to himself or also to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. All objects of the inclinations have only a conditional worth, for if there were not inclinations and the needs based on them, their object would be without worth. But the inclinations themselves, as sources of needs, are so far from having an absolute worth so as to make one wish to have them, that it must instead be the universal wish of every rational being to be altogether free of them. Thus the worth of any object to be acquired by our action is always conditional. Beings, the existence of which rests not on our will but on nature, if they are beings without reason, still have only a relative worth as means, and are therefore called things, whereas rational beings are called persons, because their nature already marks them out as an end in itself. That is, as something that may not be used merely as a means, and hence so far limits all choice, and is an object of respect." So the idea here is that an object that satisfies an inclination has a conditional worth. So think about the food on a plate when you're starving. It has all this great worth and value to you, but the minute you're stuffed and full, it no longer has any value, and it just becomes something you put down the disposal or kind of wrap up and put in the refrigerator. At that point in time, it really doesn't have much value. A person, however, does not have conditional worth because their value or worth isn't dependent upon how they satisfy an inclination. That's the role of things. Things are just there for our use as means to satisfy our inclinations. Persons, however, as sources of moral value, have an intrinsic worth or value. They are an end in itself. Much as happiness for Aristotle was an end in itself that didn't depend upon anything else or other, so too for Kant, a person has intrinsic value or worth and are to be treated never as a means only, but always as an end. And the key line here is that never as a means only. This doesn't mean that we can't go to a restaurant and have a waiter or waitress serve us our food. We can't just say, oh, no, I can't use you as a means. I'll do it myself. No, it's only when one treats someone as a means only that one then treats someone with disrespect. Whether prostitution or not falls into this category, one could make a very good argument that it does if one is using a prostitute merely as a means to satisfy one's inclinations. But then again, one could also argue that both parties enter into the relationship as a type of business transaction. And so one could argue that they aren't necessarily violating one's self-respect. But this is an issue that can generate a lot of discussion, and there is a lot of material out there that you can look into to write about this particular topic if this is something you'd be interested in doing. And so the general idea then for Kant is that humanity as a whole has an end in itself as value, that human beings have intrinsic worth or value. And it's not just as human beings, it's as rational beings. If an alien were to land and it were to discover that they too were rational and could act out of duty, then they too would be deserving and demanding of respect. So the final point that I want to bring up in this lecture and finish up Kant is to talk about some of the consequences of this theory. The first and most straightforward consequence, based on what we've just talked about, is that animals don't have intrinsic rights. In other words, they are not persons. They do not have reason. They cannot act out of duty. And so therefore we can treat them as means or as things, as that passage I read said. Now this does not mean that we can't give animals certain rights. We may choose as human beings that to be human and humane, we would give and will give animals certain rights. But that's not because of any intrinsic rights that animals have. At least that's the Kantian view. Utilitarians, which we'll get to in a later lecture, they could argue and have argued that animals do have intrinsic rights. The second consequence is the issue of abortion. And in fact, in the famous Roe versus Wade decision, the distinction between persons and non-persons was something that Harry Blackman, who wrote the majority opinion in that decision, uses. Now, Kant himself doesn't say anything about abortion one way or the other, but based on his theory that if the Constitution, and this is how Blackman argues it in the Roe versus Wade decision, if the Constitution is going to prioritize whose rights are to be upheld, then it takes priority over persons over non-persons. And in that context, then, the mother's right to choose won out over the fetus's right to life, up to the point of viability, at which point the state can take an interest in the fetus. Now, this does not mean, just as with animal rights, that we might not choose to give fetuses certain rights, not to be aborted, and so on. And we may very well do that because, the fact of the matter is, a newborn infant is not a person either, and yet we choose to give them rights, and would be accused of murder if we were to kill a newborn infant. So the fact of personhood does not by itself limit what we can or cannot do with respect to giving rights to to non-persons. But Kant's point is that only rational persons, only rational beings who can recognize duty, can speak on behalf of and act out of duty. A fetus, an infant, an animal cannot recognize or act out of duty. Only persons can do that. And that's why they have such intrinsic value. The other issue is euthanasia. In other words, we can think of people in late stages of Alzheimer's or people in vegetative states and so on. If they are no longer persons, does that mean that we can euthanize them? Well, again, one could argue very strongly or persuasively that it's contrary to our humanity to do such a thing, and so we would then take upon ourselves an attitude of respect towards such people. And I think Kant would argue that point. But it gets tricky, and Kant, in some ways, holds to his goodwill principles to the very end, and it does create some tricky situations. To give one example that Kant gives, Kant argues that if losing your self-respect meant if you had to lose your self-respect in order to save the life of everyone in your family, you shouldn't lose your self-respect. And there are other instances like that. If someone comes to the door and let's say a neighbor lady has come to your house and she says her husband's threatening to kill her, and you hide her in your room, and then 5 minutes later the doorbell rings, you think it might be the police you called, but it's the husband looking murderous and with a gun, and he asks, have you seen my wife? Well, Kant says you should tell the truth, because you are doing the right thing and you have no control over whether someone else does the right thing or not. And if they do the wrong thing, that should not affect whether your will is good or not. And so these are some of the consequences of some of Kant's theories. I mean, on the one hand, it begins with a very sensible, and it seems like it makes sense, notion of duty and the distinction between conforming to the moral law and acting for the sake of the law. But Kant follows these insights or these intuitions out to what he takes to be their logical conclusion. And he'll admit that acting solely from duty in all circumstances is hard, and not many people, if any, ever do it completely. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it. Now, one of the views or the philosophical positions that is most opposed or different from Kant's position is John Stuart Mill's, and that will be the subject of the next lecture.